If someone asked Laura what she wanted most in life, she would confidently say she wanted peace and quiet. Laura was 17, and her life resembled endless autumn twilight. It all began after her mother passed away, and her Aunt Gabriella moved into their house with her son Christian. Laura's mother had died after a long illness, and exactly 2 years earlier, she had lost her father. For a while, Laura lived alone in the house left by her parents, until one summer morning her aunt and cousin appeared as guests. Making it clear they weren't leaving, Aunt Gabriella and her lanky son started imposing their rules in the house. Firstly, they sold off everything left by Laura's parents. Laura tried to stop them, but Aunt Gabriella, known for her fierce temper, glared venomously at her with her poison, green eyes and hissed like a cat. "Don't you dare tell me what to do here, brat. What do you understand anyway?" Laura showed her the will left by her mother, stating that all the property was to go to her daughter. But Aunt Gabriella immediately snatched it from Laura's hands and tore it into tiny pieces. "There's your will," she said harshly. "Shut up, or I'll throw you out like a dog." Laura's cousin, Christian, thin and long like a scarecrow, chuckled approvingly and rubbed his hands, trembling from a hangover. Looking at her relatives with hatred and pain, Laura rushed out of the house and ran to the old guardhouse of her father. She climbed onto the creaky couch and cried for a long time, cursing her fate. All her classmates were preparing for graduation and anticipating a new life, but Laura had no money for such a happy life. The remaining funds from her mother were too little to move to the city and enroll in school. Laura was doomed to live in this forest-surrounded village under the same roof as her aunt and her perpetually drunk son. Laura couldn't hope for anyone's help. She had no other relatives besides her aunt, and the neighbors and acquaintances were of little help. There was only one way out: wait for change and hope that everything would be fine. But time passed, and there were still no changes in Laura's life. She turned 18 and then 19, and she still lived side by side with Aunt Gabriella and endured her numerous reproaches. Aunt Gabriella assigned all the household chores to her niece. From early morning till late evening, Laura worked around the house, cleaning, cooking, washing, ironing, scrubbing floors. Aunt Gabriella didn't even go to the store herself for bread, although it was only a couple of 100 meters away, and every time she sent the girl there. Laura herself didn't like going to the store for bread. Every time she appeared there, the owner, Lucas, nicknamed the oligarch by the locals, would give her coveted glances and joke around with her. Even the significant age difference didn't stop him. He was 42, and Laura was 19. And each time, he threw more and more strange hints at her. "Life isn't sugar for you," Lucas would say mysteriously, smiling at Laura. "But I can sweeten it up. Want me to?" The girl would look grimly at him and walk away, while the store owner laughed after her. Once, when Laura came to his store again, Lucas shocked her with an unimaginable declaration. "Marry me," he blurted out fervently, staring at her. "I'll do everything for you and make it golden." He popped out from under the counter, fell to his knees in front of Laura, and grabbed her legs. The girl immediately slapped him across the face. "You fool," she exclaimed, stepping back from Lucas. What confused Laura the most about the store owner's declaration was that he wasn't drunk when he said it. His gaze was clear and even honest, without any hint of falsehood. That scared the girl the most. What if the owner really had fallen in love with her, and now wanted to marry her? When she ran home, Laura told her aunt everything, and Gabriella immediately twisted her mouth into an unpleasant smile. "You should be happy," she croaked, rocking in her old chair. "Lucas the oligarch is a good man and well off. It's rare to find someone good and well off. Consider yourself lucky." Laura was almost choking with indignation, and a fire flashed in her eyes. "What else?" she exclaimed. "He's old, bald, and looks like a rat." In response, her aunt laughed loudly, and Laura, furious, jumped up and headed for the door. "Well, wait for your prince," Gabriella called after her sarcastically. "He's already coming to you on a lame horse." Laura ran to the forest ranger's hut very quickly, as if fleeing from a pack of wolves. When she reached the moss-covered hut, she sat heavily on the bench and leaned her head back. Clouds slowly drifted across the sky. A light breeze carried them far away, and Laura felt a strong desire to float away with them. Lost in her thoughts, she unknowingly dozed off and suddenly woke up to a loud scream. She was genuinely scared. There were no people nearby who could scream like that. The scream was strained, mournful. It would drop to a sob, then rise to a shriek, and in the twilight, it sounded particularly eerie and plaintive. Laura sat there, frozen, and listened to the sorrowful call of some unknown forest creature. Finally, the scream subsided, but soon there was rustling in the distance and the loud crackling of bushes. Peeking cautiously around the corner, Laura was surprised to see a little bear cub hobbling towards the hut. It awkwardly shuffled, jumped around, and kept turning its head, listening and sniffing everything around it. When it reached a rainwater barrel sunk into the ground, the cub drank its fill, then sat down and looked at the girl who had come out to meet it. "So, it was you roaring?" she asked the bear cub. "Who upset you?" The cub wiped its face with its clawed paw and sneezed, then shuffled up to Laura and nudged her leg with its nose. The girl quickly ran back to the hut, fetched some sugar left behind by hunters, and offered several pieces to her furry guest. The cub quickly gobbled up the treat and roared again, this time much more cheerfully. "Where's your mom, little one?" Laura asked, nervously looking around for the mother bear. "Are you all alone?" The cub yawned, hopped over to the bench, and curled up underneath it. Soon, the girl heard its light whimpering and decided to cover the cub with a piece of burlap. After sitting a while longer, she brought out more sugar from the hut, placed it next to the bear cub, and headed home. Meeting the little master of the forest lightened Laura's soul a bit, and all her troubles with the old oligarch and her aunt seemed petty and not worth fussing over. The bear cub, as Laura later found out, turned out to be a female bear, whom Laura named Sira. By the end of summer, Sira had grown a bit but still lived near the ranger's hut, where Laura would come to prepare food for the bear. By then, Lucas had gone bankrupt and left the village for the city, much to Laura's delight. Even Aunt Gabriella was less strict with her now. In early August, Gabriella had a heart attack and now tried to avoid any scandals to keep from agitating her weak heart. Laura's life was gradually improving, and she believed it was because of the help she had given to Sira the bear. Laura felt like karma had come full circle, and whenever she looked at Sira, it seemed the bear was thanking her. And indeed, Sira thanked her rescuer. Whenever Laura appeared at the ranger's hut, Sira would emerge from the forest and walk over to her. She would then lie down at Laura's feet and blissfully close her eyes. After enjoying the hearty meal prepared by Laura, Sira would sit next to the girl and lick her hands with her soft, smooth tongue. Having thus thanked her savior, the bear would get up and slowly wander off, only to return again later. But one day, when Laura came to visit Sira as usual, the bear didn't come out to greet her. Anxious, Laura looked into the depths of the forest, called out Sira's name, but the bear didn't appear. After searching the area and not finding her, Laura became seriously worried. Suddenly, a memory surfaced in her mind. The day before, she had seen hunters from the city arrive at the store. Thinking that Sira might be in trouble, Laura ran to the ranger's hut, threw on a raincoat, and set off to search for her forest friend. After fruitlessly exploring the familiar area of the forest surrounding the hut, Laura was about to turn back when she heard a gunshot followed by a deep roar. Rushing toward the source of the sounds, she pushed through dense juniper thickets, slipped down a steep slope almost breaking her arm, and found herself at the edge of a small lake. Climbing up and turning her head, Laura saw a strange and mesmerizing scene. Standing at the water's edge with his hands raised in front of him, was a man. Opposite him, with her head bowed to the ground, was Sira. When the man backed away, unable to handle the tension, the bear rose threateningly and swiped her front paws. Who knows how it all would have ended if Laura hadn't intervened in the standoff between the man and the bear. "Sira, stop. Calm down," she shouted, running down the slope toward the water. "You can't. Leave the man alone." The bear immediately lowered her massive paws and turned her nose toward Laura. Then, she turned toward the man and growled menacingly before slowly walking along the edge of the water, swaying her huge brown rear end. Once Syrah disappeared behind the trees, Laura approached the terrified stranger and looked into his pale face. The man blinked rapidly for a while, then dropped his backpack from his shoulders and gestured for Laura to fetch water from it. After drinking, he sank to the ground and stammered, "Thank you." The stranger's name was Enrique. He had come from the city the day before with a group of his hunter friends but had become separated from them in the forest and gotten lost. Seeing the bear, Enrique had nervously fired a shot at her, missing, which had angered Syrah greatly. She had forced him to retreat to the lake, and who knows how it all would have ended if Laura hadn't arrived on the scene. Afraid that Enrique might get into trouble again, the girl offered him to spend the night in her father's ranger hut. Enrique agreed and followed Laura to the cabin. By the time they finally reached the place, the forest had been swallowed by impenetrable darkness. After settling Enrique in for the night, Laura was about to leave, but Enrique grabbed her hand and held her back. "Stay," he whispered, wrapping himself in a blanket. "It's already night, where will you go?" Laura stayed. Warmed up and relaxed, Enrique told her a bit about himself. Learning that he was a businessman who owned 2 appliance stores, Laura looked at him attentively and chuckled. "You don't really look like a businessman," she declared. "I mean, aren't all businessmen supposed to be old, fat, and bald?" "Well, at least one guy I know." Enrique, feeling embarrassed and a bit offended, turned away to the wall and remained silent for a while. "Well, don't believe it," he grumbled. Then, throwing off the blanket abruptly, he propped himself up on his elbows and stared at Laura. "Want me to prove it?" "How so?" Laura exclaimed. "Like this. Come to the city, and I'll show you my stores. And I'll give you a gift, any item absolutely free." Laura looked thoughtfully at the ceiling and puffed out her cheeks. "And what, even a TV?" she asked skeptically. "And a refrigerator? And a washing machine, and a microwave?" Laura persisted. "Yes, anything you want," Enrique patiently nodded. "But just one thing, or I'll go bankrupt. And deliveries on me." He pulled a business card from his shirt pocket and handed it to Laura. She clenched it in her fist and stood up. "I should really go," she sighed, buttoning her jacket. "Auntie will worry. And you sleep tight. Good night." Enrique grabbed her hand again, pulled her close, and unexpectedly kissed her on the lips. Laura wanted to slap him, but for some reason, couldn't, and after enduring the kiss, she dashed out into the darkness of the night. She traversed the path home as if in a dream, moving from tree to tree like a shadow. The spontaneous kiss from Enrique still burned her lips. Moreover, she found herself wanting that kiss to happen again. This strange desire frightened Laura, but she couldn't shake it off. When she reached home, she slipped silently into her room, quickly shed her clothes, and dove into bed. She lay there for a long time, remembering Enrique and their strange encounter involving the bear. Eventually, she fell into a deep sleep. After Enrique was found by his friends, he stayed in the ranger's hut for a few more days. During that time, Laura was always by his side. Some strange, unfamiliar feeling drew her to him, and when she learned that Enrique was going back home, she felt unbearably sad. Walking him out, she couldn't hold back tears, and Enrique, noticing this, hugged her tightly and held her close. "You can come to me anytime," he said, stroking her hair. "Remember about the gift?" Laura nodded and, blushing, pecked Enrique on the cheek before briskly walking away. After going a fair distance, she suddenly remembered she forgot to ask for his address and decided to go back, but by then Enrique was already far gone. Remembering the business card, Laura searched through her pockets and horrifyingly discovered that it was missing. Sinking to the ground, Laura tried to recall where she could have lost it, but it was all in vain. Crying in despair and convinced she would never see Enrique again, she headed home, berating herself for being careless. The whole week, Laura wandered in a daze, thinking about Enrique. Finally deciding to go to the city and find him there, she took the remaining money she had and began packing. Just as she was ready to set out, something incredible happened. A car pulled up to her house, and from it emerged. "Laura, hi. I've been thinking about you all this time," he confessed right away, approaching the girl. "I've been feeling off, and now I'm here." "I've been thinking about you too," Laura whispered in response. "I'm so glad you're here." She pressed herself against him and shivered, while Enrique pulled something out of his pocket and smiled. "This is for you," he said, handing Laura a gold ring. "I want you to be my wife." Accepting his gift, Laura pondered for a while on what to do next. Seeing her hesitation, Enrique slid the ring onto her finger himself and smiled. "I agree," the girl replied, hardly believing her eyes and ears. At that moment, Aunt Gabriella stepped out of the house. Seeing the young couple embracing, she immediately understood everything and shook her head. "Well, may happiness be with you," she said with a trembling voice. "Love each other." Laura and Enrique turned to her and nodded. "Thank you," they replied together. Exactly a year after Laura and Enrique's wedding, their long-awaited firstborn appeared in their family, whom they named Thomas, after Laura's grandfather. By that time, Enrique had moved his wife into a new two-story mansion near a large lake. Every morning, waking up and taking their son in her arms, Laura would go out to feed the swans and ducks. It was the most beautiful gift fate could give her. To this day, she couldn't believe the fairy tales surrounding her and feared it might disappear like a desert mirage. And each time she realized it was all real, she blissfully closed her eyes. But as it turned out, Laura's fears were not unfounded. The end of the fairy tale was near. One gloomy November day, after breakfast, she went shopping. For some reason, she decided to take her son with her, although she had always gone alone before. Tucking Thomas snugly into his stroller, she slowly strolled along the sleepy, foggy streets, glancing at her son smiling from under his hoodie. Standing at the crosswalk, Laura waited for the traffic light to turn green. To entertain him while they waited, she started making funny faces at her son. Thomas giggled and waved his arms and legs, resembling a big colorful beetle. Lost in play, Laura didn't notice when the traffic light turned red again. Coming to her senses, she pushed the stroller and hurriedly crossed to the opposite side of the street. Suddenly, as if appearing out of thin air, a white car appeared on the road. It was speeding straight towards Laura, who stood frozen in place, watching its approach, oblivious to the cries of the onlookers. Time seemed to freeze for her, turning into a thick jelly. "Why are you just standing there, you fool?" yelled a man rushing towards her. "Move quickly." Snapping out of it at his shout, Laura pushed the stroller with all her strength. At the moment when the stroller with the baby ended up in the hands of a stranger, the car collided with Laura and threw her far back. Landing on the asphalt, she felt unbearable pain throughout her body and screamed, but her cry was so weak that the people who came to her thought it was a groan. Trying to get up, Laura jerked, moved a little aside, and lost consciousness. When she came to, she couldn't understand for a long time where she was. Everything around her shimmered dimly, resembling a huge shadow theater. When her eyes got used to the dazzling whiteness, she realized she was in a hospital room. The TV screen flickered silently. Trying to get up, Laura suddenly fell off the bed, screaming from the piercing pain in her back. She writhed on the cold floor, pounding her hands. Several nurses rushed in at the noise. They gently placed Laura back in bed and called for the doctor. "What's this, dear, why all the commotion?" smiled the doctor as he entered. "You absolutely mustn't move. Do you know what happened to you?" Frowning, Laura tried to remember everything. But the only thing that came to her mind was pushing the stroller towards the stranger. "What about my son?" she asked, looking at the doctor through heavy eyelids. "Is he okay? Please tell me he's okay." "Yes, yes, don't worry. Your son is fine," the doctor said softly. "He's with his grandmother now, so there's nothing to worry about. But you?" The doctor paused, shuffling through some papers. Then he glanced quickly at Laura and sighed. "Well, your situation is extremely complicated," he began in a quiet and somber voice. "When you were brought in, you were clinically dead, scientifically speaking. Fortunately, we managed to bring you back, but your spine. It had to be reconstructed like a puzzle, piece by piece, and..." Laura grabbed the doctor's hand and stared into his serious face. "Will I be able to walk or not?" she impatiently interrupted him. "Can I stand?" The doctor wiped his face with his sleeve and squinted. "Theoretically, yes," he confirmed after a pause. "But when exactly that will happen is very hard to say. I'm not a fortune teller, you know. First, you'll need a course of rehabilitation, massages, exercises, and much more. Meanwhile, you'll have to come to terms with this and fight very hard and persistently. Here's your means of mobility for the coming years." He nodded towards the wheelchair standing against the wall and quickly left. When the door closed behind him, Laura pulled the blanket over her face and cried. Just recently, she couldn't have imagined finding herself in such a situation, and now she couldn't even get up and walk to the window to breathe some fresh air. The only thing that kept her from falling into despair completely was the thought that her son was okay. Thus began the difficult, almost unbearable days of Laura's new life. After nearly 2 months in the hospital, she returned home, where her mother-in-law Sophia took care of her. Sophia was a short, stooped woman who looked slightly older than her 60 years. 10 years of loneliness after her husband's death had left marks of melancholy and sorrow on her face. Sophia never looked Laura in the eye and rarely spoke to her, preferring to do everything in silence. Laura felt like her presence in the house weighed heavily on her mother-in-law, and she asked her husband to hire a caregiver for her, but Enrique flatly refused. "Enough of that," he brushed off. "Mom will take care of you herself. She likes you, she just doesn't show it." But Laura didn't feel that way at all. With each passing day, her mother-in-law grew darker, and she tried to quickly complete all tasks related to her wheelchair-bound daughter-in-law and leave as soon as possible. Sometimes, lying in her bed, Laura heard Sophia arguing with her son about her, and those arguments cut through her ears like sharp blades. Sophia urged Enrique to divorce Laura, take custody of their son, and forget everything that had happened. He said he would think about what to do. Although he didn't need a wife in a wheelchair, his conscience wouldn't allow him to kick out a sick person from the house either. Laura cried in her room, realizing that in her current condition, she was not needed by her husband. But she had to endure all humiliations if only for the sake of her son, whom she loved dearly. And one day, Laura overheard a very strange conversation. Sophia was talking to someone on the phone just outside her door. Struggling to get into her wheelchair, Laura approached cautiously and listened intently. "Yes, yes. I need it exactly like that, so there are no traces." Sophia was requesting something. "Something like a sedative. Don't worry about the price. I'll pay well." "Great, great. I just need a little bit. For one. I mean, for one person." "No, it's none of your business. And why do you care who it's for?" "Okay. We'll meet in the evening and discuss everything." Mother-in-law fell silent, and Laura, after waiting a little longer, returned to her bed. The conversation she overheard stirred vague unease within her. Clearly, they were talking about Laura, but what exactly was Sophia planning? Trying to decipher this puzzle, Laura didn't sleep all night, and the next day everything resolved itself. In the morning, when Enrique left for work, Sophia entered Laura's room. She was unusually cheerful and friendly. Quickly changing the duvet and bed linen, she helped Laura into her wheelchair and winked energetically. "Shall we have some tea?" she suggested, dancing around Laura. "I baked an apple pie. I think it turned out quite well." The kitchen indeed smelled appetizingly of baking. Laura nodded with a smile without showing any suspicion, and her mother-in-law wheeled her out of the room. Once in the kitchen, Sophia started pouring tea, doing it slowly and noisily, as if distracting from something important. When a cup of tea finally sat before Laura, she glanced at it and poked at the hot pie with her fork. "Why aren't you drinking?" Sophia asked cautiously. "It's wonderful tea. My friend brought it from India." Can you imagine, they picked it right in front of her. Laura sighed knowingly and squinted. "I have no doubt about its amazing taste qualities. It's just still too hot," she lied, without blinking an eye. "Let it cool down a bit." Sophia's expression changed, and she wanted to say something, but at that moment, a crow flew in through the open window and fluttered around the room, shrilly whistling and flapping its small wings. Mother-in-law jumped up, caught the crow with her scarf, and hurried to the window. Meanwhile, Laura swapped the cups and finally took a sip of tea. "They say birds come into the house when someone is going to die," Sophia said, returning to her place. "But it's all nonsense. I don't believe in these silly omens." Laura said nothing and held her breath, waiting for Sophia to lift the cup to her lips. Unsuspecting, Sophia took a sip and grimaced. Barely placing the cup back on the saucer, she grabbed her throat and shook, her eyes bulging. Frightened, Laura rushed to her, grabbing her shoulders. "Why did you try to poison me?" she shouted, not letting her mother-in-law lose consciousness. "Why? What did I do to you?" Sophia's face turned purple, as if she had been beetroot. She stared at her daughter-in-law with a terrifying look. "You monster," she croaked, sticking out her bluish tongue. "You switched the cups." Unable to get anything more from her, Laura called an ambulance. After the medics arrived and were briefed, she packed her things, took sleeping Thomas from his crib, and left a brief note for Enrique. There was nothing left for Laura in his house, and she carefully wheeled herself down the ramp onto the street and headed to the train station. Laura desperately wanted to go home, to her native village where her old but still cozy parental home awaited her. Back in the village, Laura told her story to Aunt Gabriella. Aunt Gabriella, upon learning everything, threw up her hands, then took Laura's son and began to gently rock him, humming a lullaby. "I've been waiting for you," she said to Laura when the boy fell asleep. "I thought you were so upset with me that you didn't want to see me anymore." Laura shook her head and suddenly remembered her cousin. "And where is Christian?" she asked with concern, looking at her aunt. "Did he leave?" Aunt Gabriella bit her lip and darkened. "He passed away," she said quietly. "It's been 40 days already. He caught pneumonia and couldn't recover. That's how it goes." Aunt started humming the lullaby again, which sounded more like a quiet sob. Laura draped her fallen shawl over her aunt's shoulders and hugged her gently, pressing her cheek against her. "We're not having much luck, it seems," Aunt Gabriella said, her gaze fixed on little Thomas. "Maybe he'll have better luck. Do you think he'll find happiness in his life?" Laura didn't know what to say in response and simply nodded silently. She also wanted her son to be much happier than herself and resolved to put all her efforts into that. Autumn passed, winter came and went, and spring returned to the homeland once more. By then, Laura had somewhat recovered from her ordeal and, most importantly, learned to stand on her own feet again. Using crutches, she sometimes visited her father's old caretaker's hut and sat on the crooked porch, waiting for her old friend, Sira the bear. But for some reason, Sira never came. When leaving, Laura habitually left a few pieces of sugar for her, but each time they were snatched away by mice and ants, and there was still no sign of the bear. Perhaps she had long since left these parts, never having waited for the girl. Sometimes, when Laura was alone, she thought about Enrique and his mother. After her divorce from her ex-husband, she hadn't seen them. He never made any contact, preferring to silently send money to their son. Laura knew very little about her mother-in-law's fate. Enrique told her over the phone that Sofia had suffered a stroke and paralysis from the poisoning, and now she too was confined to a wheelchair. When she came to her senses, Sofia confessed that she had intended to poison her daughter-in-law and wanted to ask for forgiveness, but by then Laura was already gone. One day, visiting the caretaker's hut, Laura was surprised to find its door wide open. Walking around the hut, she froze in astonishment. On the lawn, cheerfully whistling, was a young man washing his head in a basin. His naked, wet torso gleamed brightly in the sunlight, and Laura even covered her face with her hand, partly from embarrassment and partly from the flashes of light in her eyes. "You scared me," she said loudly, addressing the stranger. "What are you doing here?" The stranger rinsed his head with clean water, tossed the basin into the bucket, and smiled at Laura. "Am I that frightening?" he asked, wrapping himself in a towel. "But seriously, sorry, I didn't expect anyone to show up here." The man thoroughly dried himself, then put on his jacket and approached Laura. "Well, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Clark," he said, extending his hand to her. "And you?" Laura introduced herself, and Clark sized her up with a playful yet attentive gaze. "Why are you using crutches?" he asked. Despite her annoyance at this rather tactless question, Laura told Clark about what she had been through. The guy listened attentively, then circled around and flexed his long fingers. "Would you mind if I take a look at your back?" he asked, rubbing his unshaven face. "Maybe I can help with something, who knows?" Laura, unsure whether to be amazed or annoyed, reluctantly shrugged off her coat, then slightly lifted her shirt and shyly glanced at Clark. He, unfazed, approached her closely and began to feel her back. "You have a spine like an ironing board," he smirked, moving his fingers from one vertebra to another. "I wonder where the doctors were looking. But no worries, we'll fix this." He gently pressed on one vertebra, then another, and ran his fingers along the entire length of her spine, from neck to lower back. Hearing a crack, Laura almost screamed, but by then Clark had finished and lowered her shirt back down. "Try bending forward and backward," he requested, watching each of her movements closely. "Just gently and smoothly, no rush." Laura leaned forward lightly, then backward, and was surprised to find that the movements came unusually easily. Clark, seeing his efforts weren't in vain, rubbed his hands satisfied and smiled. "Now try taking a step without the crutches," he asked, stepping back a few paces. "Also, gently." Laura tossed her crutches onto the grass and moved her right foot forward. After a few steps, she staggered and almost fell, but Clark quickly caught her and led her to a bench. "Well, it's still too early to talk about walking without crutches," he said, sitting down next to Laura. "I think in a week or two the situation will improve." Laura looked at him in amazement and swallowed the lump in her throat. "Who are you?" she managed to force out. "How do you know all this?" Clark tilted his face towards the sun and squinted. "I'm just a forester. Came here from the neighboring village," he said calmly, inhaling the fragrant pine air. "As for your question, my grandfather was a renowned bonesetter. The whole village used to come to him, and he taught me a thing or two. Grandpa's been gone for 5 years now, but his knowledge still helps people." Clark glanced at Laura, who blushed shyly. "So, will I be able to walk?" she asked, looking down at her legs. "Without crutches?" "Where would you go?" exclaimed Clark, patting Laura on the shoulder. "My grandpa got a guy trampled by a bull back on his feet, and that guy had all sorts of back problems. Miguel, our neighbor, had triplets just recently, right before I left. He was carrying them around the village all day." Inspired by his story, Laura slowly stood up, fetched her crutches, and returned. "There, go ahead and walk," Clark whistled, squinting mischievously. And you were afraid something would go wrong. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and looked towards the thicket. All right, it's time for me to get to work, he sighed, extending his hand to Laura. Nice meeting you. If anything, drop by in the evening. I'll make some tea. Laura shook his hand energetically and smiled. I'll definitely drop by, she replied. Clark had already turned to go when suddenly there was a deafening crack from nearby bushes, and Syrah emerged onto the lawn with two small cubs. Spotting Laura and her companion, Syrah turned her huge head towards them, sniffed loudly, waved her paw, and clumsily led her offspring away. Oh my goodness! My heart almost jumped out of my chest, Clark breathed out as Syrah disappeared from view. I wonder why she didn't bother us. Laura looked wistfully towards where Syrah had gone and shook her head. We're friends, she said, turning to Clark. It's an old story. I'll tell you over tea sometime. Clark silently smiled, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and strode into the thicket. Before disappearing into it, he turned back and waved to Laura. She waved back and slowly walked in the opposite direction towards her home. She really wanted to tell Aunt Gabriella about how the strange forester Clark had restored her ability to walk. And she also wanted to see Clark again and share with him the story of her acquaintance with Syrah. Thinking about all this, Laura walked leisurely past towering pines and firs, hardly leaning on her crutches. Now she had no doubt that soon she wouldn't need them anymore. Their time had passed, and it was time for something new and wonderful for Laura.